We are very, very happy to have Dr. Marty Baylor here with us today. Just a few announcements before we get started. First of all, you may have seen an email about an alumni mixer that Life After JILA is hosting. So this is going to be on November 9th at 5:30 p.m., I think, 5 p.m. at the Rayback Collective. And we're going to, students are invited, postdocs are invited, anyone from JILA is invited, as well as JILA alumni. We've had really good RSVPs from a lot of JILA alumni from all sorts of companies and organizations in the area. So it'll be a really great opportunity to network. And we encourage you all to sign up. If for whatever reason you guys haven't received the link, we'll be sending it out again, but feel free to come talk to us also. Also, we are recruiting more volunteers to help with Life After JILA. So we would love to have people come join and help us organize talks in the future, as well as organizing the alumni mixers. Some perks, you get to choose what sort of food we have, and you get to choose what sort of speakers we have. So, you know, if you're looking to network, looking to join a company, and you maybe want to talk to someone from a company that you want to hire you, this is like a really, really great way to get connected with JILA alumni. Or if you want to talk to amazing professors and hear about their career routes, it's a great way to get connected that way. So we would love to have you come volunteer with us. And if you're interested, just come see us after the talk or whenever else. Oh yeah. Also, after this talk, a little bit later in the evening, we're going to have a meetup at the Sink. We're going to be meeting there at 5:30, but if you want to walk over together, we'll be meeting outside the JILA Tower at 5:15. Again, that's under the tower, 5:15, and then we'll walk over together as a group. If for whatever reason you can't come right at 5:15, you're welcome to join us at the Sink, and we'll be providing some snacks and appetizers and that sort of thing. So we hope to see you all there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. So Dr. Marty Baylor graduated from Kenyon College in 1998, after which she spent 2 years teaching middle and high school physics and astronomy, and then worked at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center as an optical engineer. Dr. Baylor then completed her PhD in physics here at CU Boulder in 2007. During her PhD, one of the highlights was that she traveled to Shenzhen, China, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, to work as an intern for Hans Laser. After earning her PhD, Dr. Baylor traveled, volunteered with Habitat for Humanity, and worked as a visiting professor at Carleton College before accepting a 2-year postdoc in the ECEE department here at CU Boulder. Dr. Baylor now works as a professor of physics at Carleton College and recently completed her 4-year stint as the Carleton College Chair of Physics and Astronomy. Dr. Baylor has served on the APS panel on public affairs and as the chair for the APS Committee on Education, and was awarded an APS Innovation Fund grant to develop the APS EDI Fellows Program. She is also a whitewater rafter, a traveler, and a Lego enthusiast. And we're really excited what she has to say about her career.
And then is the Zoom unmuted? Okay. It's my pleasure to chat with you today about my life after JILA. It might be a little bit different than your previous speakers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about any particular project that I did, but if you want to know, please ask me, and I can actually pull up another slide deck and I can go into that. And sort of tell you sort of maybe the more personal side of life after JILA and my experiences here and how that informed my path since then. I'm going to be fairly open and transparent, but I'm happy to answer questions about anything that you see in my talk. So we are going to start off by talking about before JILA, because that certainly impacts my life after JILA. So I'm originally from Columbia, Maryland, and I consider myself first gen. My dad was a long distance bus driver. He worked for Trailways and got paid by the mile, so he wasn't home a lot. My mom was a family daycare provider, and she watch children in our home. Her degree is associates in fashion and design. My dad technically has a master's in photography, but I didn't actually know that until after undergrad because he was never home. This is my grandmother Martha, whom I'm named. That's half of my first name, which is Martha Elizabeth. Elizabeth is my other grandmother. And then I have 2 brothers, and this is my cousin Olivier, who lived with my grandmother. And I lived with my grandmother before my mom came home to start the daycare. So she worked at Amtrak, and so very much influenced by my extended family, which all lives within like 20 minutes of where my grandmother lived before she passed away. But the fact that I consider myself first gen means that I'm navigating a lot of this process from a place of not knowing. There's another picture that should come up at some point. Okay, so I went to undergrad at Kenyon College, and I actually have more undergraduate credits in Chinese than I have in physics, which explains why I went to China to do an internship. During this time, the faculty saw my potential as a physicist, and so they were very much grooming me for graduate school. I didn't know what that meant. I just took the classes that they told me to take, and I rebelled by going to China because it meant that I wasn't going to take every physics course the department offered. I didn't plan on having a mental breakdown my senior year and having to deal with suicide, mental health, and that was when I decided that I couldn't go to graduate school. I also ended up dropping all non-essential physics courses. So not only was I not only missing 1 semester of physics because I was in China, I actually missed 2 semesters of physics, which was going to impact my ability to go to graduate school. But I graduated there, and I mean, if you look at this picture, you don't see somebody who is suicidal and falling apart, but that's the state I was in. My parents didn't actually learn that until just before I went to graduate school. I told them. So I managed to hide that part of my life for 4 years from them because I just didn't want them to know. So after I graduated, if I wasn't going to graduate school, I got a job teaching physics because I'd spent a summer doing research at the University of Washington in physics education. And so I was like, I guess I can teach physics because I'm graduating and I need a job. But this was actually one of the most amazing mentoring experiences I had. So the physics department was Jennifer, Liza, and Mita and me. So an all-female physics department. These were amazingly strong women. Liza was amazing with middle school kids and taught me how to do that, which is one of the reasons why I like working with middle schoolers in outreach. But in addition to putting my life back together during this time, they were just amazing mentors and supportive people as I was sort of trying to figure out who I was and where I wanted to go with my life. So I decided during my time at Murray that I wanted to go to graduate school, but I didn't have the coursework to do well enough on the physics GRE, right, because of the courses that I missed. So I loved teaching. I absolutely loved teaching at the Murray School, but I needed time. And as a teacher, your time is spent grading and lesson planning and things like that. And so I got a job at NASA so that I could have my evenings and weekends free to study for the physics GRE. And that's what I did. But during the day, I had sort of 2 main projects. So one was developing optical test beds to select between different MEMS technologies. So MEMS is microelectromechanical systems for use in the near-infrared spectrometer in the James Webb Space Telescope. Okay, so I built a test bed to sort of evaluate these technologies and choose between them. And the other was working, I don't know if any of you know Nick Schneider. He's in astrophysics over here. But he was my boss at NASA because I was designing a telescope to study the aurora on Jupiter. So when he saw me in the halls around here, he's like, oh, you're going to work for me as a grad student, which meant cheaper? And I said, no. I'm going to do other things. But those were the 2 projects that I did over my 2 years at Goddard. And I did study for the physics GRE and got into grad school and everything. So the reason that I chose Boulder, so let me bring up my Boulder picture here. So the reason I came here is because, again, first gen, not understanding really what I was doing or why I was doing it. I wanted to be in an absolutely beautiful place that I could live the rest of my life, so that when grad school sucked, I didn't hate where I lived and also where I was working. I didn't actually know what I wanted to study, and so I wanted a program whose program was big enough that I'm sure I could find something to study. But what I told them is optics, optics, I love optics. And that allowed me to get an NSF IGERT in optics, and so that really solidified my focus on optics. By the way, the reason that I chose my undergrad at Kenyon was because they spelled my name right. So again, Martha Elizabeth doesn't fit in the blanks. I got lots of mail from Martha Eli, Martha Eliza, Martha Elizab. And names are important in my family, and so I only applied to 2 schools that I chose because they spelled my name right. And so Kenyon was one of them, and I applied to MIT because my parents were like, Marty, you're smart, you can go anywhere. And I said, we don't have any money. And so they said, pick one. And I said, they didn't spell my name right. And so they picked MIT. And so then I had to explain why I was going to go to Kenyon, because I did get accepted to MIT. So I can say I turned down MIT. And I think that Kenyon was a good fit for me, actually. So I ended up here at Boulder, and I worked with Dana Anderson doing optical signal processing. And so I completed my PhD in just under 5 years. I had 5 years of NSF funding, and so this was 2 weeks before my funding was up. And so this is me defending my PhD in independent component analysis at radio frequencies, basically trying to solve blind source separation, separating out signals optically as opposed to using digital signal processing techniques. Okay, so then what now? That's really what this talk is about, is what happened after that. And so what happened after that is definitely informed by all of my experiences up until then. I knew that I was a person who loved small environments. I loved being in Colorado, but there were challenges that I faced. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my post-defense state. So I felt a sense of accomplishment, right? I had completed this degree, and there was a sense of relief of, passing the oral exam, but there was also a disconnection. So, right, people here, like, I won the authority of the faculty or whatever, but I was disconnected from my family. So, right, I'm first gen. There's nobody else in my generation at that point who had, I think one of my cousins had completed undergrad, but I'm older than her, so I did that before she did. And I was the only one who had a PhD. And so when I went home and wanted to talk to people, they assumed that I didn't speak English anymore. Because not only I had a PhD, but I had a PhD in physics. And so there was this huge disconnect between the people who were supposedly my people, my family, and me over something that, like, I didn't feel like I was any different. And that's also a sense of the letdown, right? It's not like I suddenly grew an appendage so that people were so that I was substantively different. I was the same person. I just given a talk, and now suddenly I'm something different, but I'm not. You can't see a PhD on me. So there's some letdown. There was definitely some burnout. There was anger, there was frustration, there were battles that I had to fight that I didn't feel like I should have had to fight during my time here. And some of those battles I wouldn't say won, I worked around, and some of them were completely unsuccessful. And so I definitely needed a break. There were gaps in my mentoring. And you should never expect that whoever you're working for is going to be able to supply all the needs that you have personally or professionally. Personally might be awkward. But like, you have friends in the group or whatever, and that provides maybe a social group. But in terms of the mentoring to be a professional in the world, most faculty are not trained to be a good PI. They're not necessarily trained in how to mentor people. And so they sort of do what they've done or maybe what they're naturally good at, and don't necessarily support you in filling in those gaps. So this isn't, it's sort of a commentary on the system, but I had some particular gaps that were not fulfilled that should have been. So, or at least 2 of them should have been. So one is I graduated with no papers and no hope of papers for my PhD work. And that's not because I didn't have work that was worthy. On that computer is a copy of a paper that should have been submitted almost 20 years ago, but I was not allowed to submit that paper, okay? That's a big issue. I had limited attendance in conferences. So I attended the National Society of Black Physicists meetings because they paid for students to attend. So when I couldn't find faculty funding, I went to places where I could present my work that provided a source of funding for me, right? So what does that do? Oh, it gave me a community of Black physicists, and I still have phone calls and Zoom calls with those physicists once a month. So it was good support, social support there, but very limited networking and very limited opportunities for professional development. And so in terms of like big meetings like APS, SPIE, those sorts of things, Clio, 1, maybe 2, over my 4, almost 5 years here. And I didn't have any grant writing experience. And that's not something that necessarily is something that you have to do during a PhD, but sometimes, having that sort of an opportunity to get funding for yourself, for your own ideas, contribute to a PI's grant, that's an important development, especially if you're going to go into academia. And so, does that impact my future career options at this point? So my original plan was to go back and teach middle and high school physics, right? I'm first gen. I don't know really. I kind of know what professors at Kenyon did or whatever, but it's not a culture that I grew up in. So it's not something that sort of I just figured, oh, I'll get a PhD. It's kind of like what I tell my students it's not. It's like more undergrad. Okay, that's not what a PhD is about at all. But I didn't really know that. So my original plan was just to go back and teach middle and high school. And for that, the mentoring gaps are not a big issue. But there were people here at JILA who were saying, Marty, I've seen you in sort of a teaching, mentoring type modality. Also, PhDs go and become professors. Like, that's what you do. So Marty, you should consider being a professor. And so, as I thought about that and considered what my personal passions are, you don't want to stand next to me at the grocery store because somehow I'll teach you something. It might not be physics, but I'll teach you something. And I love mentoring. I love doing outreach. I love making physics, and in particular, my specialty of optics, accessible. I want life to be accessible. I want my students to not have to struggle in the ways that I struggled. I want to prepare them for graduate school so that they don't have to experience the things, and to sort of be aware and create broader mentoring networks and things like that. Like that is my passion. That's what I love to do. And so, okay, maybe I consider a different path. And the professoriate was where I was being pushed. But the gaps that I had here are huge impediments to going into academia, right? Because what's the currency of faculty? Papers. Okay, papers are the currency of faculty. Okay. And so as I sort of thought and reflected, well, I know that a lot of PhDs go to R1 institutions. I don't see how that's going to happen given my gaps, but maybe undergraduate teaching is an option, maybe community college. I don't know. But it happened that I was recruited at an NSBP conference to do a position at Carleton College. So thinking forward to my immediate next step, so I defended, and 2 weeks later, I started a visiting position at Carleton College. Okay, so and the way that I thought about this was explore before I commit. I can always choose to be a middle and high school teacher. They're desperate, particularly in STEM and even more so in physics. Okay, that's always a door that's open to me. But in terms of academia, there's sort of a train that you get on, and you kind of got to stay on that train as long as you want to continue or can continue on that path. So I figured that before I commit, let me do something that is not a long-term commitment and take a visiting position at Carleton. So that was in fall of 2007. And they initially hired me for 1 term and said, Marty, you're doing a great job. Why don't you stay for 2 terms? You're doing a great job. Stay for 3? Nope. Because I needed to rest. 2 terms got me benefits. So it was really in my best interest, since I didn't have a plan for benefits for the entire year. So 2 terms was actually really good. And it allowed me to get back in teaching, which I desperately missed. But the 3rd term, I needed a break. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Carleton. So it's a small liberal arts college in Northfield, Minnesota. It's about 45 minutes south of the Twin Cities. It's got about 2,000 students. It's an undergraduate-only institution, and it's on a trimester system, hence the 3 terms. Okay. The physics and astronomy department has 8 faculty and graduates on the order of 20 majors a year, somewhere between 14 and 30 physics majors. And in terms of the institutional values, which I would broaden from Carleton to be primarily undergraduate institutions more generally, is that they value high quality teaching. They really want to know that you're doing the best in not the industry standard, right? Not lecture. They want to know that you're doing sort of the best practices in your field. Faculty have research programs, and they need to include undergraduates as parts of those. So the idea is not that I'm necessarily in the lab by myself, but that I'm bringing undergraduates into that space. Very much value close relationships and mentoring of students. I know a lot about my students. My students come to my house. They watch my cat when I'm out of town. And it's weird. I never thought that I'd be texting with students like after they've graduated, but that's a thing that happens. And students, ask me for thoughts on like their post careers and things like that, because you really do. They're small classes. You really get to know the students. And then I also have departmental and institutional service. And that looks differently depending on where you are in the tenure process and post-tenure, but that is an expectation that you're contributing to the life of the college in some way. So what did I actually do during that visiting position? So I taught classes. So these are some students looking through pinhole cameras that they made. I taught an upper level optics elective that was a theory-based class. I taught an intermediate modern physics lab, and I taught some introductory courses, which includes a mixture of majors, non-majors, pre-med sort of students, and then one class that was primarily pre-med intro class. So a nice breadth for me to get a sense of what is it like teaching on these different levels and different populations. And then they asked me to develop an elective optics lab. So this is an optional add-on to the theory course. And I got the opportunity to actually call up Thor Labs and say, hey, I'm creating this lab. And they're like, hey, you can buy $3,000 worth of products. And I did that with Edmund too. I think I raised $6,000 in addition to the money that the department gave me. And that was actually based on the lab that I took at JILA when I was an optics student. Not entirely, because these are undergrads, not graduate students, but that's where I sort of got the idea and pulled from initially. I explored Minnesota, so this is the North Shore, Lake Superior, and the winter. So this is the St. Paul Winter Carnival. They have ice sculptures and snow sculptures. And this was a beautiful 40-degree day. This did not look like this at the end of the 40-degree day, but in the morning it was very beautiful. And then I asked lots of questions about what this path was, in particular given the challenges and gaps in my mentoring. So after I finished that, I needed some time to rest and recover. And so I lived off of my savings for about 4 months, and that's because I needed to reconnect with who I was. I felt like I was a different person, in some ways broken, and I wanted to see if I could figure out how to get back to the Marty that I was before I started grad school. And so during that time, I fulfilled a promise. So the family I lived with when I was doing the internship in China asked that after I get my PhD, I'd come and visit them. So I went back and visited them for a couple of weeks. And then I lived in the moment. And so what that means is I'm a person who, even now, my calendar is starting to fill up for next year. Okay? I'm super organized, I plan ahead. And I was so used to doing that I didn't know how I felt. Like how are you doing today? Fine. Like I don't know I don't know how I feel, because I just got to get up and do these things. It doesn't matter how I feel about them. I just have to do those things. And I needed to reconnect with myself. So I actually wouldn't allow myself to plan anything more than 2 days in advance. I volunteered for Habitat for Humanity in the sense that I knew when in Boulder and in Longmont they were building, and then I would wake up that morning and decide, do I feel like that's something I want to do today? It's hands-on, it's giving back to the community, and that's something that I value. But some days I was a little bit too depressed and I just didn't want to be there. And I spent a lot of time on the roofs of houses in Boulder and Longmont in a way that allowed me to be near people. They were below me, but I was on the roof by myself and I was looking at beauty. I was looking at the mountains and the Flatirons, and that reconnected with my soul. So in times when I wanted to be near people, but I didn't want to talk to people, that's what I would do. It was I would go volunteer and hang out on the roofs of houses and paint or whatever they needed me to do. No technical reading. So I went to the library every week and picked up a stack of junior science fiction and fantasy novels, and that's what I read. And then just lots of personal reflection time, and coming to the conclusion that I am a different person, and that's okay. I can't get back to the person I was, because I'm not innocent in those ways anymore. But I'm still a valuable person, and I'm okay with who I am and who I've become, is basically what I needed to get to, and what I did get to by the end of that 4 months. And then I used that year to sort of prepare. So as I was at Carleton, I was setting myself up to fund a postdoc, which if I got the funding, I could turn it down if I decided that wasn't a path. But I didn't want to have to, while I was trying to decompress, I didn't want to have to worry about finding a job. So I lined everything up and got everything taken, the application for the fellowship submitted by the end of fall 2007, and the postdoc set up by the end, if I got that funding. Okay, so years 2 and 3 after JILA. So my goal for that time was, I had a good time at Carleton. And so I set up for a tenure track position at a primarily undergraduate institution. And so my goals for that 2-year postdoc was I needed to publish a paper. I needed to develop a research program that was going to be suitable for undergraduates and figure out what a startup, right? So when ultimately Carleton came to me and said, we're going to give you this much for startup, I didn't, is that good enough or not? I'd never set up a lab. And so by setting up this program during my postdoc, it would allow me to sort of, okay, I need this and this and this, and this is the infrastructure I need, so that when I was applying for that job, I could actually speak to that intelligently. And given that I'd figured out that if I wanted to pursue a position at a small liberal arts college, I would have to leave Colorado. I wanted to stay in Colorado as long as possible because it's my heart home. So something that I value is natural beauty, but I also value, I want to live in a small town, and I don't want to have a long commute. And Colorado College, as close as it is to whitewater rafting, I just couldn't see myself living in Colorado Springs. So I looked at the country, the United States, and crossed off states that I'd be willing to live in, and I found 2, Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I mean, I was just, most people when they're looking for faculty positions are just like, I will sell my soul, do you want me? Okay, great. And they go there because the goal is the faculty position. I was entertaining this idea because people were pushing me in that direction, because I didn't really know what I was supposed to be doing with my PhD. So I was much more restrictive. It turns out that Carleton had a position at the right time-ish, and so I was able to sort of satisfy where in the country I was interested in living. And so my approach was to do a 2-year postdoc in, it has gone through different acronyms. It used to be ECEE, I think it is now ECEN, but it might have shifted again. But I ended up working with Bob McLeod, and that should have a K in front of it. He knew what my challenges were. So I had been upfront with the gaps in my mentoring that I needed to fill, and so that enabled me to do some negotiation, and we both entered this experience eyes wide open about what I wanted to get out of it and what he was willing to provide. So negotiated the scope of my project, the intellectual property of the project, and because I really wanted to focus on undergraduates, I agreed to serve as his lab manager and manage the graduate students, which was great because I love mentoring. So that wasn't a big ask at all. So basically, I developed a program for undergraduates in Bob's lab. So I shifted to working with photopolymers in order to prepare for this faculty position. And so in Bob McLeod's group, he works on direct, or at least at that time, direct write lithography of 3D refractive index structures in photopolymers. And he connected me with Chris Bowman, who was doing 3D microfluidic features. And so what I was trying to do was to try to integrate that into integrated optofluidic devices. So combining refractive index features and physical features in a single device in these photopolymers was what I was trying to do. And so my goal was to simplify the processing of the optofluidic devices, which led to sort of material science sort of research. And so here's a optofluidic device where some poor graduate student has aligned a single mode fiber across a gap. Okay, let's avoid that. Can we direct write those features so that they are self-aligned by the masks is basically the question. And then as you tweak the material, what can you do to, how do the optical features change depending on what materials you use in terms of the chemistry? And so I only worked with undergraduates, and Bob allowed me to have all of the intellectual ownership over this. So if, for example, I was publishing this out of my postdoc by myself, I would be the author on that paper, or I would be the first author on that paper. And if I published it with Carleton students, then I would be the last author. He doesn't have to show up if I don't want him to in the author list at all, and one of the students would be first author on that paper. So I negotiated all of this ahead of time so that we didn't reach this point and have any sort of conflict. So I should mention, so I did end up publishing, but there was a timing issue, and Bob actually suggested that I wait until after I get to Carleton to publish this. So basically, rather than publishing it right after my postdoc, which I could, to wait till I got to Carleton, got some Carleton students to work on it, and then I could publish it as part of my tenure portfolio for work I did at Carleton, but I had actually done most of it before I got there. So that was like a little bit of a strategy move to sort of help me along my path. Okay, so where did I land after my postdoc? So I got a tenure track position at Carleton College that technically started in 2009, which was it was after the first year of my postdoc. So that meant when I started my postdoc, I was applying for the position at Carleton, which is not what I had intended to do. So Carleton, after the visiting position, they contacted me and said, "Hey, Marty, are you going to apply for our tenure track position?" I was like, I had a good time, but I really need to do this postdoc if I'm going to be successful in tenure track position. And so I think the timing is just not great. And what they told me was, "Marty, we would rather you apply and wait a year so that you could be successful at tenure than force you to start in the middle of your postdoc." So they actually encouraged me to negotiate, to delay actually starting at Carleton for a year in order to finish my postdoc. So that's what I did. But I did negotiate access to my startup funds during that 1 year. So what that meant is when I set foot on campus, I didn't have an empty lab. My lab was full of boxes. Okay? Why was that important? The optics lab was on the 3rd floor of the physics building, and the elevator couldn't fit an optics table. They had to take out a window on the 3rd floor in order to get my lab in, which they couldn't do during the academic year. Okay, so I would have, if I hadn't negotiated that, I wouldn't have been able to start my research for a year. For an undergraduate program, that's an infinity. I got my first paper with only Carleton students, not work that I had started on my postdoc, 3 days before I submitted my tenure packet. That paper was accepted. Okay, so I wasn't thinking about this at the time. This is advice that people gave me, but it made a huge difference in my ability to be successful. And then looking at the institutional expectations at Carleton, roughly my job is 60% teaching and mentoring students, 30% research, and I even consider research as mentoring and teaching, and then 10%-ish service. So that seemed like the right balance for me. The expectation for publications is less. So I had 2 papers that included me and Carleton students. One of them did include Bob as a second to last author, and then one with all Carleton students. One of the things that also counts towards tenure at Carleton is that I collaborate with faculty at other institutions. And so in working with their graduate students, again, this is a strategy, their graduate students are trying to get papers out. Me supporting their graduate students resulted in me ending up on their graduate students' papers without me having to do a lot of writing, and they count towards my tenure portfolio. So it looks like I have a bunch of papers, but a lot of that was actually just thinking about strategy and what is valued at a small liberal arts college. And then grants are encouraged, but institutional funding to support research and student stipends is available. So Carleton has a lot of, so the physics department has endowed funds, STEM has endowed funds, and the institution has endowed funds. And so between all of the sources, I have a way of funding students. And if I need research support beyond like I use up my startup, so I don't have funding and I don't have a grant, there are modest resources to support that as well. Okay. So again, so I did get a grant during that time, but it wasn't the sort of the temperature around those things that I was worried about because of gaps in my training were mitigated. And I did look for that in terms of asking lots of questions when I was at Carleton. And then the other thing is that I intentionally focused on my life needs. Okay, I wasn't driven by the job. I mean, I was partially driven by the job because I wanted something that I was interested in a place I wanted to do that work. But I'm important, I am valuable, and the things that I need in my life to make me happy are important in that consideration. And so I live in a state that values and invests in natural beauty and the arts. When I met my husband, we met here, he was singing in the Denver Opera Chorus, he was in an Irish pub band, he was in a madrigal group. Like, I couldn't separate him from the arts, so we needed to go to some place where he had an outlet. It turns out that he actually prefers the Northfield Theater, so the small town environment, and he plays in the Cannon Valley Regional Orchestra and sings in the community choir and stuff, because he only has to drive or walk to get to those rehearsals as opposed to going up to the city. But being in a state that values and supports those things is really important to us. We live in a small town and we have a short commute. So my husband's office is 0.6 of a mile from campus and mine is a mile from campus. And so most of the year, except in the winter, we walk, we bike. In the winter we drive, like it's cold. Like and then the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport is a major airport. It's a hub for Delta. And so I can get home pretty quickly and inexpensively. And that's really important to me. I don't want to be near my family, but I want to have access to them. Does anybody have a relationship like that with their family? And then I have access to Colorado. It is my heart home in the summer. I don't ski. So I don't care where I am in the winter. But in the summer, I collaborated with Bob for a number of years before the pandemic. I would send students here. I had to have research collaboration meetings in Colorado in the summer. Darn. And then stay and do some whitewater rafting. And so I have found ways to craft a life that allows me to meet sort of the different facets of who I am and be happy. Right? I want to be a professor. I want to be a person that when you walk around, you see me smiling and happy. Right? I want people to look at me like, I want to do what she's doing, because she seems like she's enjoying life. And yes, I get busy, and then I have my thinking face, and people are like, Marty, you look like you were grumpy. I'm like, oh, I was just thinking, hi, how are you? But that's the kind of person that I want to be. And so what does my life look like? So I certainly teach. I spend time in Colorado. You might recognize a student in this picture. So I come to Colorado and I interact with my students, whether they're doing research with a collaborator or just to check in on how they're doing. I sort of do a check and see who's in Colorado and arrange to meet with them. I do research. I am on several APS committees, so I'm getting involved on a national scale. I do my whitewater rafting. That is a thing that happens. I've spent 20 days on the river so far this year. Not at the same time, but sort of spread between trips all across the country. This is really what recharges me. So I try to do as much of it in the summer, and because I'm on sabbatical, that was a definite focus of my sabbatical. And then these other pictures represent, so my husband and I build a Lego kit every Christmas together. We have a cat named Juliet, who's our nanny and tells us where to be and how to be. And then we have friends that are good enough that they made me a wreath of Khan. Does anybody get that reference? Wrath of Khan, Star Trek, for Christmas. So we've built a community, my husband and I have built a community in Northfield that allows us to sort of take these pieces and put them together so that we can have the type of life that we want to have together. So this is my last slide. I'm happy to answer questions like, what is tenure like at a small liberal arts institution? Or can you tell me more about this research program? Or whatever you want to ask me, I am completely open and would welcome those questions. So thank you.